Okay, sorry about that short delay. I would like to thank the Dean and the organisers and everyone for inviting me here today. I've had a very enjoyable time in Malaysia over the last week. And as some of you know, I'm very familiar with Malaysia. I have family here. My wife is Malaysian, so it's very good always to come back to Malaysia. And it's wonderful to see you all here for today. I am going to talk about methods before I talk about anything else. And I'm going to talk about the role of methods and how to use methods. One of the things that Dr. Hanise said to me was students are often wondering about methods. They haven't used methods before in their research in their undergraduate years. And so they're thinking, well, what are methods? How do I use them? What do they do? How will they help me? So I'm going to address all those questions. And along the way, I will show you some examples of how to use methods as well, and how methods connect to things like research question and so on. And I've chosen my examples. I'm a media and communications professor, but I've chosen my examples that are from media and communications, but that also cross over into tourism studies as well. So there's something to keep you interested. If you're from a tourism studies background, I'll talk about a tourism campaign that will give you some interesting insights into how communication works in tourism. So interdisciplinary. Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about. This is the contents page, and this is the list of things. So I'll start off by talking about the very big question of why we do research in the first place, because you can't really talk about methods out of context. You've got to think about what it is that you're actually doing. Then I'll talk about, well, what are research methods and research design and methods, and what methods are available. I'll touch on some debates in methods, because there are debates in methods that are interesting to think about. Then I'll talk about ethics, how to choose methods, and then the case study. And the case study is sort of, it looks like it's at the very end, but actually it's the sort of second half, really. So why do we do research? This is interesting to think about, and the question of why we do research really goes back to the foundations of the modern university. And the first Western modern university was founded in the 11th century, I think, in Bologna in Italy, and it was part of a monastery. And one of the ideas behind the founding of that university was academic freedom, and the idea that researchers should be investigating aspects of society that have been not thought about. The first university really focused on philosophy. Philosophy was the core discipline. There was an earlier tradition as well, an Islamic tradition that dates back a couple of hundred years before the founding of the first Western university, that was really about scholarship and the building of wisdom and Islamic knowledge. So some of those traditions were appropriated in the founding of the Western University, which developed through the second millennium into the period known as Enlightenment. And this quote from Immanuel Kant kind of is a very famous quote, and it's from his short essay called What is an Enlightenment? And he's talking about knowledge and the importance of knowledge. And what he's saying is, dare to know, have the courage to use your own understanding. And the context for this was the Enlightenment, the period that he's talking about in the West, was very much challenging the preordained power of the church and the nobility. And Immanuel Kant was saying, well, we need to ask questions about the church and the nobility, and we need to have the courage to ask those questions. Because until then, knowledge had been top down. Knowledge had come from above, and it was divine. It was the word of God. In the 17th and 18th century, that opposition started to reverse, and humanism started to become the core ideal through which knowledge was formulated. So that question, dare to know, have the courage to use your own understanding, was very revolutionary at the time. Through this period, the modern university was starting to evolve. The university as we know it was starting to evolve. And that process has happened through Italy, happened through France, and it happened through Germany, into the UK and so on. And with the founding of the universities that you kind of, that we revere, Oxford and Cambridge and so on, were sort of founded through this period. And solidified through this period as centres of learning and investigation. So this is the very long tradition that, without realising it, most of us here are working in. And this is the tradition that really our research comes from. But what do we need to know something? How do we know things? What does it mean to dare to know? To know, we need evidence. How do we find that evidence? We research, and this is what research is. It's the process of discovering and using evidence to support a hypothesis, to answer a question, to address a problem. In finding that evidence, we have to do it in a systematic way. Our research should be purposeful. It should have some kind of sense of what we're doing the research for. We should know why we're looking for evidence. We should be focusing on specific research questions. And how we address those research questions is through methods, through using methods to discover evidence to support the propositions that we are investigating. So it's a very systematic process. And for many postgraduate students, many graduate students, it's a very new process. In your undergraduate degrees, most of us are using the work of other researchers, and we're assessing and bringing together a massive secondary research. I find with my own students, when I sit them down for the first meeting, when they first start doing their coursework thesis in their honours year or in their master's degree, they sit down and they think, well, what am I going to do? And I say, well, you're going to learn how to use methods. You're going to do primary research. And they say, well, what is primary research? How does that differ from the research that I've been doing already? And I say, well, the research you've been doing already is based on secondary sources through your undergraduate degree. So you haven't had to go out and find primary basic evidence. And what you're going to have to do now is go out and find basic evidence that you're going to use to address your research questions. So methods are tools. Methods are not something to be afraid of. They're tools that we use to discover specific forms of evidence to address the hypothesis, the question, the research questions that we've formulated for ourselves. Methods aren't an end in themselves. We don't sort of think of ourselves and think of our projects in terms of the methods we use. We think of them in terms of how we use those methods to find out something else. And that's kind of really important to understand. That's not to say that you won't start to identify with certain methods. I certainly do. There's certain methods that I use over and over again in my research, and I think of them as methods that I'm very familiar with. And you will become familiar with certain methods as you go on in your research, especially if you go on to have a research career. And that's because they suit the kind of work that you're doing. They suit certain kinds of research questions. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we go on. What methods should do is that, well, first you should develop them in light of your conceptual framework. So your conceptual framework is where you think about the work that you're doing, the questions that you're thinking about, and then you think about all the other work that's been done to answer similar questions. And you think about how that work might guide you in answering your questions. And you develop a conceptual framework, which is a way of understanding the questions that you're asking in the context of your discipline. Once you've got your conceptual framework, and that'll be based on your theory, which Robin is going to talk about a bit later on. Once you've got your conceptual framework, and once you've thought about it in the context of your research questions, you need to think about what your methods are going to do, what you're asking of your methods. And really what you're asking of your methods is to give you a verifiable, reliable, and if possible, and I'll get to this, repeatable way to find out exactly what it is you want to find out. So they're a tool, they're a means to an end. Most methods, most research projects involve 3 stages. Observation, where you collect your evidence. Analysis, where you recognise the patterns within your evidence and theoretical frameworks and your conceptual frameworks are mobilised there. And then synthesis, where you apply your insights through publication or through writing a report or through advice that you might give to contexts out there in the real world that are relevant to the research that you've done. Methods are involved through that process in observation. So you need to know what you're observing and how you're going to observe it. In analysis, through the pattern recognition and so on, methods are a tool for analysis. And then not so much in synthesis. By the time you get to synthesis, you've used your methods to come up with your insights. One of the interesting things about methods is that they're not fixed. And this is actually the fun part. At first, we use methods as a kind of guide, and we'll hold on to our methods, and we'll hold them very close, and we'll take them quite literally, and we'll follow them as kind of an instruction book for what we're going to do. But there are debates in methods, and methods are changing all the time and being developed all the time. I think back to when I first started researching media, so 20 years ago or so, when I was a postgraduate still, there was no social network analysis, none at all. Since then, we've all learned how to use Python. We've all learned how to scrape data down from social media, or many of us have, and we've all learned how to analyze that massive amount of data that you can sometimes end up with when you do a big scraping exercise over several weeks. That's a whole new method. So social network analysis is a whole new method, and that's been developed just in the last 15 or so years. And this happens all the time. Methods are developed in adaptation to the world around us that we are investigating, to the questions that we're investigating. So I was asked to talk a little bit about research design and its relationship with methods. So just on this slide, I'll talk about that a little bit. And as you will have seen so far, I'm trying to be very practical so far. I'm trying to give you ways of thinking about the projects that you're doing. So the project that you're doing, why did you get started? Why did you start? Why did you choose your particular topic? It was probably because you were curious about something, right? It's because you wanted to know about something. And that's great. What you need to do then is design a research project around that curiosity and develop your curiosity into a systematic way of investigating something. And that's research design. So the research design process is all about organising your curiosity into a feasible research project. The practicalities of this, and I'm still very, very practical here, is you'll need a purpose statement. This thesis, this book, this article, whatever it might be, will do this. And sometimes you'll state that very literally, sometimes it will be implied, but you need to have a purpose. You need a conceptual framework, you need some research questions. 1 to 3 is usually pretty good. You can have more, but you need to think about scope if you're going to have more and how you're going to contain the scope. And you'll need methods for addressing the question. You'll also need a timeline and a budget. Research design is one of the most fun parts of research, I find. Thinking about how to design a systematic way of researching a particular question, issue, or topic is really fun to do. And with a PhD project or with a coursework project, you will be doing quite a bit of thinking about the aspects of how are you going to design this? How are you going to do it? What's your plan for doing what you think you're going to try and do? Good design, good research design flows from one thing to the next. So the RQs the research questions will flow from the purpose statement and the conceptual framework, and the methods will derive from and be appropriate to the research questions. You kind of develop a nice cascade, a nice sequence and a process that you will go through as you work. And you'll find that if it's a PhD length project or even a minor thesis length project, 15,000 words, I think yours is that right? You'll find that having a plan like that is a very reassuring thing, and developing a timeline around it is a really reassuring thing as well. It gives you something to go back to and to think about and to systematically work your way through the process so that it doesn't feel overwhelming, so that you think, oh, I can relax now. I think I know what I'm doing. And then you can sort of work out a bit, oh, okay, yeah, I do know what I'm doing because I'm doing this. And it's there in front of you as part of your research design, a research plan. So now let's start thinking about methods. Methods are huge, complex, interesting, and a really, really broad area. And one of my favorite areas, something that I think about a lot. I've supervised lots and lots of different research projects that use lots and lots of different methods. I find in my own research projects, I keep going back to particular methods that I'm very familiar with and that I use for reasons that they are very compatible with the type of research that I'm doing and the types of questions that I'm asking. And I'm going to show you some examples from that as we go on. So, you know, what are you doing? What discipline are you working in? Here we've got a fairly narrow range of disciplines, but still we've got an interdisciplinary group here. You're asking different sorts of questions in different sorts of contexts, disciplinary, professional contexts, and so on. You need to think about, well, what research methods are available to me? What's on the table? What can I use? This is just a list of some of the things that you might use and some of the disciplines that you might commonly use these in. Ethnography and participant observation is something that I've done a lot of, especially digital ethnography, which is a slightly controversial area because you don't really have that much interaction with your research subjects. You can't really just interview them on the spot like you can in face-to-face ethnography, but you can still lurk on sites and find an enormous amount about what's called the emic perspective, the lived experience of the people on those sites. I find it a really useful way of understanding the social dynamics of particular social media platforms, and in particular, particular groups on those social media platforms. A lot of my research projects have evolved just from casual ethnography that I do. And once you're an ethnographer, you're always an ethnographer and you're always thinking about the situation that you're in. You're always observing people, you're always observing the way people speak, who speaks first, who speaks second, which gender speaks first, which gender speaks second, who has the power in the room, who occupies the powerful space in the room, who occupies the least powerful space in the room. You think about all that. So I'm looking at you people who park yourself right up in the back corner thinking, aha, you know, that tells me something about where you see yourself in the room as well. And as an ethnographer, you're noticing these kinds of things all the time. In digital ethnography, I'm looking at what groups do online, and I'm looking at particular groups a lot of the time. So I'm partly an anthropologist and I'm partly a media studies scholar. The particular groups I look at, I can't interact with them because they're mostly comprised of extremists, and I research a lot of online extremist groups. So interacting with them would actually be quite dangerous. If they find out who I am and that I'm among them, they will be not very happy at all. So I lurk and I listen and I watch and I learn to understand who the most active participants are, who the least active participants are, how the power dynamics work within the groups, and how people speak and what the issues that concern them are. And it's really interesting. You know, one of the things that's interesting about ethnography is that you walk into an ethnographic kind of context, into a situation, thinking this is what people are going to be interested in. Actually, usually it's not. Actually, usually you're surprised by what people are actually interested in and what actually motivates people. So your hypothesis, often you're throwing it out the window. It's a really nice method, a really useful method, a bit of an old-fashioned method in some ways, ethnography, but in the digital context, it's sort of coming back. So I use it, and these are just some of the disciplines that you might want to use it in. I actually did a little bit of digital ethnography in research for this paper. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Archival research, if you're working in history or literary studies, that's what you're going to head for. You're going to head for an archive somewhere. You're going to say, oh, I need to go to the British Museum. I need to go to the Library of Congress to research this. I need to go to a particular library where the papers of a particular author are held. Textual analysis, literary studies as well. You know, that's usually a kind of close reading, and this is a method I'm quite familiar with. Critical discourse analysis. This is a method that I'm very familiar with. It's my favorite method of all. And I know all the work of all the theorists and all the debates in this area. And I'm going to show you a little example of how to use it a little bit later on. With critical discourse analysis, what you're mainly interested in is power and how power is embedded in language, at least the critical discourse analysis that I do. So who has power? How does power circulate? And how is that power expressed through language? A good way of thinking about that, critical discourse analysis, and I'll talk about this a little bit more that as we go on, is who is the we and who is the they in this language? Who is the in-group and who is the out-group? How is the in-group describing itself? How is the in-group describing the out-group? What language are they using? What terms are they using? What dynamics are being set up? And you can see how this is very compatible with the ethnography that I also use as one of my main methods. Often what I'm doing is I'm transcribing things that are happening online, or I'm copying it, and then I'm putting them into in vivo, and I'm coding them and working out what the structure is of the discourse. Political economy. Political science and media studies. This is also about power as well, and understanding how power works. But it's all mainly about economic power and how economic power is exercised and how economic power is encoded through the structure of society, and how that encoding of power in that coding of economic power in social structures plays out through the operations of corporations or government or organizations of some kind. Focus group. This is something that I've done a bit of as well. This is one of those really unexpected methods as well. You get 8 to 10 people in a room, you've recruited them, you sit them down, and you have a series of prompts. It's kind of like a group interview. And then you start asking questions, and they start giving you answers that are totally unexpected half the time, and that are really surprising a lot of the time. And that's the fun of research. Things don't always follow the methods that you're using, or the methods you're using don't always give you the results you expect, actually, is a kind of a way of describing that. Interviews. This is something that is a very popular method across most disciplines. So no matter what you're doing, you will have probably considered, oh, should I do some interviews? Again, expect lots of unexpecteds in interviews. You know, interviews are, you know, I've just, with a group of colleagues in China, we've just interviewed about 35 people to do with Hanfu culture, and they belong to Hanfu societies across China. If you don't know what Hanfu is dressing at the moment, it's very popular, dressing in traditional Han Dynasty clothing and going to tourist sites, photographing yourself and putting them, the photographs on social media. And it's really interesting because there's a sort of hidden cultural nationalism in that. You know, there's a sense in which they're recuperating pre-Manchu China, and that ancient divide between Ming and Qing dynasty is really important in terms of the Han mythology of Han superiority. So there's a kind of, there's a latent nationalism in what they're doing. And sometimes that's really clearly articulated. When we first started doing the interviews, we thought, yep, they're going to talk to us about nationalism. That's what they're going to talk to us about, the Manchus, and you know how they're wanting to revisit the elegance of Han Dynasty China compared to what they see as the sort of barbarism of Manchu China. That's what all the existing scholarship told us they would say. They didn't say it. They said all sorts of other things. And the other things they said were all about mediatization and self-presentation. So theories of nationalism, not so useful. Theories of self-presentation online and the way that people frame themselves as belonging to online communities. So online sociality and the role of online sociality in self-presentation online. That was what they were interested in. And that was really, really interesting. And it told, the earlier research was quite empirical as well. So it told us that something had changed since 2013 or so, when the earlier research had been done. It had become more of a fashion and less of a statement about Chinese identity, which I thought was interesting. But the statement about Chinese identity is still deeply embedded, because the context of Han is the context of kawaii in Japan, the context of K-pop and that kind of popular culture, and anime culture in Korea and Japan, but it's the kind of Chinese version. So it does have that Chinese identity aspect to it, but it's a very pop culture phenomenon at the same time. So that's really interesting. And we found that out through interviews. Surveys. How many of you are thinking of using surveys as a research method? Yep, lots. Yeah, and I've done quite a bit of this as well. It's really interesting. We could do a whole session just on survey design and what questions to ask and how to ask them, how to create a beautiful sequence of questions, how to keep people engaged through the questionnaire, all those kinds of issues, how to recruit. I mean, this is a big issue with surveys, is how to get a good sample, and that's kind of paramount. So working how to do that. And we can talk about that perhaps a bit later on, because I'm going to leave. I was told to leave 10 minutes, but I'm going to leave a bit more at the end for more general discussion, so we can have sort of a workshop kind of vibe. And network analysis, which I mentioned earlier. So all that work of scraping and so on. I have to admit that usually when it comes to social network analysis, what I do is I advertise for a research assistant, and I get someone to do this for me a lot of the time. And one of the research assistants I use, he's just like, oh yeah, okay, you want me to write a Python script? Okay, bang, 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 and he'll have it written in about 15 minutes. Oh, you want to find out this? Bang, 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 he'll write the script. It would take me 2 hours to write that same code. So I'm very, very happy to pay him to write the code, which is great. But you can find out all sorts of things, but you end up with massive amounts of data, just massive, like literally documents that are just pages and pages and pages of stuff you scraped. And the other problem that I'm finding with it at the moment is that as online communication becomes more mimetic, so more based around visual images and memes, so scraping becomes a much less useful method, because the memes don't get scraped. You have to go back and tediously go through the whole feed and start screenshotting it and so on, or saving it as PDF if you possibly can to get that content. So why did I go through this list? I went through this list to give you a sense that research is context specific, and each one of us is working in a slightly different context when we research. A disciplinary context, but also the context of our research problems, the way in which we're looking at the world and asking questions about what it is that we're looking at. Every one of us has our own research context, and every research context has methods that are better than other methods, has methods that are appropriate to it. And being able to choose your methods and think about your methods and knowing what methods are out there for the different research contexts is a really big part of using methods. Pick the wrong method and it will sort of lead you down an interesting path, but sort of into a forest and you'll get lost somewhere. Pick the right method and it'll be like just driving on the highway. Everything will start to happen around you and your data will come in and you'll start to think, yes, 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 this is really interesting. I can see how this is going to help me address this data is going to help me address my research questions. Because one of the big challenges in research is gathering the data that is appropriate and right for the question, and that's actually harder than it looks. So knowing how to do that, and that's where your supervisor will give you guidance. And I've been speaking to students over the last week as well, and I'm sure my colleagues here as well have been as well. Thinking about what's the best method to address this question is a really important thing. And how am I going to recruit? Where's the data going to come from? How am I going to find the data? How is the world going to tell me what I need to know? What questions? How do I ask the questions of it? Now, methods are interesting to think about, and I'm just going to take you just very briefly touch on some of the debates in methods. Because I said before that methods are always changeable. They're always moving. There's always new things happening in methods. It seems like a really boring subject and a really like, yeah, okay, this is how you do stuff kind of question, thinking about methods. But actually, there's lots of debates, and they're interesting debates. And this is one of the major debates that have taken place in methods over 30 or 40 years, qualitative versus quantitative methods. Which should you use? What's appropriate? What should I be looking at? What's the difference? Sometimes qualitative methods can become quite quantitative, actually, based on the number of people you interview and so on. Sometimes quantitative methods can demand qualitative questions or raise qualitative questions. So there's no strict dividing line between the two, but this has been a really big debate in just about all disciplines. And I think it's a really, it's an interesting debate to think about. I don't take sides in this debate. I have colleagues who do take sides in this debate, and it's always funny talking to them about it, especially the people who are passionate about quantitative research and who believe that qualitative research tells you nothing meaningful. And I do have several colleagues who have that view, and it's very good fun to take them out for coffee and get them going on this. It's very entertaining. With quantitative methods, what you're looking at there is scale, usually. Not always, but usually. You're measuring something at scale. You're in the world of numbers with quantitative. Potentially, you're looking for some kind of scientific certainty. You're looking for something that's reproducible. You're looking for something that someone else could go out and do exactly the same thing and come up with pretty similar results. And you'll be using statistical methods. You'll be looking for p-values and all sorts of other things to test your data as you go through. And that's all great, but the disadvantage is that you don't generally get to hear the voices of your subjects in quantitative analysis. So you can miss out on a bit of nuance. You miss out on the subjective presentations of your subjects to you that can sometimes tell you unexpected things, although you can certainly get lots of unexpected data in quantitative analysis as well. It's a while since I've done a huge quantitative thing, but a few years ago I did a massive project which involved surveying all the major publishers of Australia about their staffing, headcount, financials, a huge array of data. And what we were looking for was how scale impacted profitability in the publishing industry. So it was a really big quantitative project. And it was good fun, it was great, but I felt a certain sort of lack as I was doing that project. I thought, oh, I can't wait till we get to the interview phase of the project so I can actually hear what they have to say about what they're doing rather than seeing a whole lot of numbers about what they're doing. And that's because I'm probably a born qualitative researcher more than I'm a born quantitative researcher, even though I have done quantitative research. Qualitative, I love, because I love to hear the voices of research subjects. I love to hear what people have got to say about their lives and experience. I'm interested in people's personal accounts of how they understand their online activities and what it is they're doing online. And I love human voice. So for me, I love qualitative methods because I get to hear those voices. Trouble is, I'm only getting to hear 20, or maybe like with the Hanfu project, 35 voices. Now, there must be at least probably 100,000 exponents of Hanfu culture across China. I'm listening to 35 of them. Is that representative? Probably not. So I'm hearing their voices, which I love, but how scientific is it? Not very. So what do you do there? Well, 35 interviews is actually quite a lot. It's actually a pretty good sample in terms of interviews. But out of 100,000, it's a pretty small number. So you acknowledge those limitations. Yeah, and what we talk about in the paper is, okay, we found 35 people. This is how we found them. And also this is biased too, because we're recruiting them based on their interest in being recruited, right? They're responding to a call out that we're putting out on the main platforms where they're active. There are going to be lots of people who don't respond to that call out. And it might be that the people who respond to the call out are a particularly passionate group who are responding to that call out because they're not representative of the larger group. How do we capture, for example, people who are, what we're getting is the people who are totally committed Hanfu fans. What about the people who are just semi-committed Hanfu fans? They're not likely to have much of a harmful identity, and they're not likely to respond to a call out for a survey. So we're not capturing the grey area at the edge of the group. We're just probably capturing the hardcore fans. So we have to acknowledge that, and we have to talk about that when we discuss the methods in the research. And we have to acknowledge at the end that that's a limitation of the research. What we're saying is that, yes, this research can tell us something about these 35 fans, but we can't really extrapolate from these 35 fans to the entire Hanfu population in China. What we've got is a little sample. In a way, that's fine, because it still tells us something about the world. It still tells us something that we didn't know before, but we have to acknowledge it. So that's the limitation of qualitative, that lack of scale. Quantitative, as I've said, tends to be a focus on numbers. Qualitative tends to be a focus on words and on the analysis of meanings. And so it's a different kind of analysis. With words, when you're analysing words, what you get is a lot more complicated lexical formulations than you will get in a survey result or in any kind of quantitative research. Because quantitative research, you're kind of boiling things down right from the start in your survey questions. It's a really good idea to have a box for comments. I always recommend that in a survey, because that gives you the opportunity to hear people's voice as well as count what people are doing. But still the focus will be mainly on numbers. With qualitative, the focus is on the words, what they're saying. I'm prepared to put up with all the endless limitations of qualitative research just to hear the voices, because that's what I love. But those are limitations. One of the interesting things about these two different approaches to research is that they tend to emerge out of a kind of different philosophy about what research is as well. With quantitative research, it does tend to be, in practice, more evaluative. So usually often, not always, but with quantitative research, often you're testing something. You're testing an existing theory. You're testing an existing framework. And that's great. That's fine. We need to do that kind of scientific testing of the world that we're in and the assumptions that we make about the world that we're in. And that quantitative research will give us an opportunity to do that. Qualitative tends to be more exploratory. Qualitative tends to be a bit more like a journey without maps. With quantitative, you've got your map, you've got your ways there, and it's telling you where to go, and you follow it, and you're testing the environment around you. Qualitative, it gives you a chance to develop new insights about the world and develop new insights about the methods you're using, the approach you're taking, the group you're looking at. Every aspect of research tends to be open to question in qualitative research, whereas quantitative tends to be narrower. And it's really interesting. I do a bit of research. I've started doing a bit of research with the medical people at my university. And that's been really great fun because they're really, really quantitative, right? And I'm really quite qualitative, but they're realizing that they've got some wicked problems. And the problem they're investigating is resistance to vaccination, which has increased a lot over the last 3 or 4 years. So how do we investigate resistance to vaccination? They've realized they can't just do a survey because that's just going to tell them that there is resistance to vaccination. It's just going to tell them what they know already, probably. So they've come to us and said, look, we need to talk about how we're going to investigate this in terms of a qualitative method. So we're going to have to go out and interview people, talk to people, and do all sorts of work around that to understand what the factors are. And I've already done some publications on vaccination resistance, so I kind of know what some of the factors are already. And surprisingly, actually, a lot of them in the West are ideological factors, not medical factors. And that's really, really interesting. They're to do with what ideological tribe you belong to, rather than your attitude to science and medicine, although the tribal and medicine attitudes do overlap. So this is really interesting to me because suddenly the medical people are doing a more exploratory form of research, and they want to know how to explore a question that they don't have quantitative answers to. It's great. I really enjoy working with them. It's such fun working with hard science and with hard scientists. They're really entertaining. Good fun to work with. And it's I must say, it's such fun wandering around in the laboratories and seeing the kind of work that they do too. It's, in my university, the medical faculty is huge, and there's about 5 or 6 hospitals that are directly connected to it. It's half the university in size is medical faculty. And yet you never talk to each other. So we've started talking to each other. That's great. So quant and qual are starting to intersect and inform each other in our methods across the multidisciplinary problems that we face. Replicability. This is another debate, and this flows from how replicable can your research be? How replicable should it be? I have somewhat controversial views on this, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. Your supervisor might have a very different view. Listen to your supervisor, not to me, if they disagree. The problem I have is replicability ever fully achievable? I think not. Some of my quant colleagues think it is. They think I do a survey 1 month, you do a survey the same month, we should get exactly the same results. My survey should be designed and your survey should be designed so that the field tells us the truth. And the truth is unvarying, and whatever research we do, we're going to discover that truth as long as our methods are sound. And 2 researchers can go out into the same field and get exactly the same results. In theory, that should be possible. My view derives from the ancient Roman poet Heraclitus. You cannot step into the same river twice. The field is always changing. You could research a group on social media 1 week and then research it a week later, and it would be quite different depending on who is participating that week, depending on the topics that are being discussed that week. We had terrible issues with a PhD and this is not an uncommon problem across my discipline, with a PhD that was started just before the pandemic, where we're looking at online discourse in certain groups around certain topics to do with extremism and so on. In the space of 6 months, those groups and their topics changed. They all stopped talking about the anti-Semitism and so on that they've been talking about, and they all started talking about sovereign citizen movements and freedom movements and all sorts of other things to do with COVID-19. And COVID-19 threw, I know this isn't the only PhD project, I'm just getting a knowing look here, the only PhD project that, suddenly the field changes, the world changes very quickly sometimes. So can you step into the same river twice? I'm pretty convinced that you actually can't, and that scientific replicability is a beautiful ideal sometimes, but one that is rarely achieved, and one that, this is my controversial view, one that you shouldn't break your back trying to achieve. Research is specific. You're researching a specific group of people, specific questions at a specific time, in a specific context, a specific locale, using particular methods. All those things are variables. And those variables are all constantly changing. They're not going to stay the same for you. And they're not going to stay the same for the next researcher who comes along. So there you go. I'm against replicability. But should we just be against replicability altogether? Should we just say, no, can't be done. Let's just all go our merry way and do our own research? I don't think we should do that either. So much depends on the skills that you develop as a researcher in terms of the results that you get. And this is one of the really nice things about it, is the process of developing these skills as you go. And I look back on my sort of postgraduate life and I think, oh God, I wish when I was doing my PhD, I knew the things that I know now, about how to do things, and about how to go out into the field and find out things. All research methods, as I said before, involve observation. And your observational skills develop as you go. And often they develop because of what you've read about what other researchers have done and how they've used their methods to find out things. So you get better at doing critical discourse analysis. You get better at spotting things. I mean, my students, no, I'm going to sound like I'm bragging if I say this, but my students say to me, oh my God, you can read like 3 sentences and you can analyze it and come up with 2 paragraphs about what's going on in those 3 sentences. And that's because I'm really experienced in critical discourse analysis, and my supervisor of my PhD taught me in very fine-grained detail how to close read discourse for power dynamics and for the different modalities that exist within any given unit of discourse. And if you look at a really good critical discourse analysis, they can analyze a classified advertisement and come up with some findings about the way that power is working. They even really dry functional texts can still yield good data, let alone when you get into an interview situation and you're analysing the interview afterwards and what's been said to you, or looking at a social media feed and what's being said on that social media feed. So skill and your observational power is really important. And really that's just reading, that's counting, that's listening. And, the greatest skill you can have as a researcher is the ability to listen, the ability to say to your interview subject, instead of asking the next question that you had planned, doing a semi-structured interview, saying to your interview subject, oh, what you've said is really interesting. Do you have anything more to say about this aspect of it? And sometimes they won't. But sometimes it's like pressing play and they'll give you a lot of really, really good insights. So just those little prompts where you sit in the background and you let your interview subject take the driving seat and talk to you and give them just little prompts. And what you're doing there is listening. You're learning to stop talking. And as researchers, we often do a lot of talking. We're presenting all the time. You learn to listen instead. Listen to your data. It has things to tell you. It's like music. It has melodies. It has things within it. It's in a key. It will tell you things if you know how to listen to it. So listening is really important. The other thing I would say is judgment. So knowing what's good data, what's not good data. And this goes back to methods as well, and that debate about qualitative versus quantitative. Even your most quantitative researcher is still using judgment. You're asking certain questions for certain reasons. You're making judgment calls right from the start when you start designing the project, because you have to contain scope. And all research is about containing scope. This is probably something that you've thought about a bit, because it's probably a problem that you've all had with your work, is scope. And it's a problem for everyone. You know, we all start off with really big questions, and we end up having to make them smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as we go, till it gets to the point where it's researchable. And that's about the exercise of researcher judgment. The other thing I would say is that it's really important to have a reflective process as part of your research. Think about, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Think about harm, potential harm, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But also just to reflect on the methods that you're using and what the possible limitations are. And I mentioned before, those 35 interviews out of a possible 100,000 or so interviews, even more probably. The ability to reflect on the limitations of only doing those 35 interviews and how they will impact the findings, that's a really important part of your research as well. And it's a really important part of methods, because all methods have limitations, and we should all be reflecting on the limitations of our methods as we go. And that's a beautiful process, you know, learning to reflect on your methods as you go. Ethics. So the word harm is really big in ethics, and all research can potentially do harm. So how do you minimize harm? How do you do that? The harm might be to your research subjects. It might be to other groups, depending on what information your research subjects reveal. If my research subject if my interview subject starts to tell me something about their lives which is out of scope, but which is personal, they might be into a topic, but they start talking about their kids or whatever. That's getting into a harm territory. They probably are forgetting that the research process, they're being recorded, and it's going to be transcribed. And people do forget themselves in interviews and start just chatting, right? And when that happens, you kind of have to be really mindful that there's potential for harm in that. And as a researcher, what I do is I'll just delete that information from the transcription, because it's not relevant and it's potentially harmful content. People might reveal something about the operations of the company, because a lot of the interviews I've done are about professional practice. I had a interviewee, I was interviewing someone who had edited a very famous book, and they told me that they believed that part of that book had been plagiarized. And I thought, oh, this book was published 30 or 40 years ago. It's a canonical, very famous book. That information has potential to do massive amounts of harm. What do I do with that information? Should I disclose it to someone? Should I just keep it secret? Should I not reveal it? As it happened, I went also to the archive of that publisher, and this is Penguin Books. And in Australia, this is amazing. Penguin Books have got the papers, all the papers and correspondence to do with every single book they've ever published. And it's all in a warehouse, all in manila folders. It's this magnificent archive. So I went to the archive for that particular book, and I found that those doubts had been expressed right from the very beginning, and that they were well known within the publishing house. The author of that book is Indigenous. So there's another layer of complication. I decided not to disclose. You know, if I was a journalist, I could have gone out and got a headline from that story. But that secret stays with me. It's in the archive, yeah, and us. Well, I haven't mentioned any names, you might notice. But that can all sit in the archives. That can all sit there until someone else comes along, because that's not what I was interested in, but it was disclosed to me inadvertently as part of the interview. So that potential for harm can just pop up all the time. And I believe it actually would have harmed the interview subject as much as anyone else, because the author of that book has a godlike status. Their reputation would have almost certainly survived. The interviewee would have been disbelieved, probably. So that potential for harm is really ever present. And I was really shocked after that interview. I walked away and just thought, oh my God, what did I just hear? You know, and I'm just sort of reliving it in my head now, actually. I sort of wandered down the street outside this editor's house thinking, oh God, you know, this is just really, really like, there's too much, you know, for one day. So that's why I went to the archive. I thought, oh God, you know, how can I verify this? You know, what other source might there be? And I did find the correspondence. So you need to be ethical. You need to think about harm to interview subjects, survey respondents, people who might inadvertently disclose things to you. In the first instance, is your project ethical? Are you actually using methods in an appropriate way to elicit certain responses to people in areas that might be a risk, areas to do with ethnic identity, religious practice, family history? You know, all these areas take you into harm potential areas. So you need to think about that when you're considering your research project. And this is where you need to reflect. And you need to think about potential harm to yourself as well. I mentioned before that I spend a lot of time doing digital ethnography on various extremist sites. There's potential harm to me. My ethics clearance will not allow me to reveal my identity or even to reveal my presence. I can't. I'm not allowed to post even under a pseudonym. So I'm not allowed to incite or create any kind of conversation apart from the conversation that I'm seeing. And that's fine by me, actually, because these people are not nice people, and other researchers like me, whose identity have been revealed through one means or another, you get all sorts of threatening emails, and you know, people find out your social media identities and start trolling you on social media and so on. It's not much fun. And it has happened to me, not because of my identity being revealed in the ethnography I use, but because of things I published, where I've been looking at particular groups, and they must have a Google content alert set up. The moment anyone publishes anything about them, they get it, and then they send you a very rude email. So harm potentially to researchers, disclosure of things. And so how do you mitigate and eliminate these risks? And you do this by thinking about what you're doing, by reflecting on the ethics of what you're doing all the way through the process. Your own subject position comes into play here. We as researchers mightn't feel very powerful even as students, but we do occupy positions of power. We are educated. We have the privilege of belonging to a university. Not everyone has that privilege. We have the privilege of having these tools at our disposal and having time to use them. So reflecting on our positionality as researchers is really important all the way through the process, because that impacts the way the process is designed and unfolds. So self-reflection all the way through is really crucial in using methods. Reflecting on the methods you're using, how you're using them, your relationship with your subjects, all those things. Okay, I'll get through this slide very quickly because I want to get to the case studies. Thinking about your RQs and the conceptual frame are you using, and this is just a couple of little sort of tips about what context you should use what methods in. I got a feeling you kind of know this already, that you've already passed this step in your research projects. So I'll just skip over it. One thing I will say that's really important in methods and just research generally is to read. Reading is a really crucial part of what we do, and it's a crucial part of developing methods. So being guided by other similar research in your discipline. What methods are other people using to address similar problems to you? What can you learn? I'll read whole articles about topics that I'm completely uninterested in because of the methods, because I'm interested in how the methods were used. and what problems they came across and how they overcame those problems, sample size, selection, whatever it might be. And feasibility. Your method has to be feasible. You've got a certain amount of time to do it, maybe a tiny amount of money for recruiting. You've got to be able to do that. And I mentioned before that recruiting participants is one of the biggest issues. Okay, now at the case study. I've chosen something that is funny and entertaining and disastrous, because disasters are much more fun to research than where there is no disaster, and that will be interdisciplinary, that those of you who are doing a bit of tourism and hospitality research will be interested, as will those who are doing media communications. Tourism Australia runs campaigns to get people to come to Australia. And they've been doing this since 1984. The first campaign was called Come and Say G'day. And it starred this bloke at the top there, Paul Hogan, who at the time was a massive celebrity, had his own TV show, he was a comedian, very, very popular. And he was the star, the central figure in this campaign. I'll show you a clip from the campaign in a minute. This campaign was designed, up until then, Australian tourism campaigns have been mainly static images and mainly images of marsupials, koalas, kangaroos, possums, echidnas, all the things that Australia is famous for. They were all there. It was like, come and see our animals, was what they were saying. What this campaign tried to do was say, come and have a good experience. So it was based around a concept of a tourism experience. So it's an experiential campaign as opposed to a mammal-based campaign. And it was huge. It was fantastic. It was very successful. And I'm just going to ask whoever runs the thing, have I got audio on the PowerPoint as well? Because you'll need to hear the audio when I show this clip. Yeah, should have audio. Okay. So this is the very first TV advertisement in this campaign.
America, you look like you need a holiday. A fair dinkum holiday. In the land of wonder, the land down under. Now there's a few things I got to warn you about. Firstly, you're going to get wet. Because the place is surrounded by water. Oh, you're going to have to learn to say goodnight. Because every day is a good day in Australia. You're going to lucky. Apart from that, no worries. You'll have the time of your life in Australia. Because we talk the same language. Although you lot do have a funny accent. Come and say good day. I'll slip an extra shrimp on the barbie for you.
What do you think? It's entertaining, it's fun. You can see what I mean by about experiential. There is a kangaroo there that hops across the beach, but it's not like it's all koalas and kangaroos. Hugely successful campaign, massively successful. Tourism numbers skyrocketed. Lots of Americans came. That was shown in American primetime TV. Amazingly successful, so successful that they kind of got stuck on that one campaign and ran it way beyond its normal lifespan. This is the most recent ad. This is what they do now.
Where are you, Mum?
Australia. And you look like you need a holiday.
Show us what you got.
Let's go. Welcome to the Sydney Opera House.
It's fun.
Yep, it's amazing.
You know, we're mates. G'day, my name is Freddie. There's nothing like Australia.
Special, huh?
You would make a great movie.
So what are you waiting for? Come and say good day. We come from a land down under.
So, in terms of methods, there is so much that could be said about those two advertisements. I'm going to show you a third one in a minute. One of the things that's interesting about this ad is the way it repeats discourse from the first one. You look like you need a holiday being the most obvious example of that. It's kind of like they're reflecting on that first campaign. And there's a reason for that. And that is across the 40 years between these two campaigns that I've just shown you, it's been an unmitigated disaster of failed campaigns. An absolute black hole of failed campaigns. Campaigns that were so failed, they had to be pulled, that were so bad that they created national controversy. One of the interesting things about this ad is that I discovered, and I think Tourism Australia are hoping that no one would discover it, that it's actually a stolen idea. The same idea is used by the Qatar Tourism Board, the same animations interspersed, you know, the touristic puppets basically as they go around the nation. So it's not original. That's the first thing about it. But there's some other things we could say about it as well. It introduces Indigenous people, and that's actually really important. And a lot of the criticism of earlier campaigns was that they were all white. They didn't show any diversity whatsoever. Australia is like Malaysia. They're both very multicultural countries. And you didn't get a sense of that in the first ad at all. You get a little bit more of a sense of it in that ad, but actually it's still nowhere near representative really. But at least it does show Indigenous people who are completely written out of the first campaign. It shows Ayers Rock and some of the other things. And that first ad started off at Ayers Rock. So that's another thing where it references that first campaign, Uluru, as it's now called under its Indigenous name. So there's all sorts of echoes in that campaign of the earlier campaign. So as I've said, there's been multiple campaigns in between, none of which captured the magic of the original and none of which had the same success in drawing tourists to Australia as the original had as well. Some of the campaigns have been an absolute unmitigated disaster. So the one in the image at the top, and I'll spare you the advertisement for this, I've got it on my hard drive if you want to have a look, but I'll spare you. This featured a woman in bikinis who's a model who walked along beaches and monologued about how wonderful Australia was, and then turned to camera and said, so where the bloody hell are you? Yeah, that was a very common response, actually. I mean, people were horrified. Like, Australia isn't about women walking along beaches in bikinis, you know. And interestingly, that ad, because you remember that first ad, they had a woman walking along a beach in bikini as well, walking up to the male host. I mean, critical discourse analysis paradise in terms of analysing the gender dynamics in that advertisement. You know, just you could write a whole essay about it easily. And the race dynamics as well. I mean, it's a nightmare. But anyway, you know, this Where the Bloody Hell Are You campaign was so horrible that online petitions were started against it. The people rose up. Here's a really interesting little bit of tidbit of gossip. The person who signed off on that Where the Bloody Hell Are You campaign was the head of Tourism Australia at the time, who was a guy by the name of Scott Morrison. You might recognise that name. He later went on to become the Australian Prime Minister. Some say that his judgment as Prime Minister was around about as good as his judgment as Australian Tourism Manager when he signed off on that campaign. Very poor judgment. There was another campaign. That campaign was such a disaster that they decided, and the 2008 campaign, which I'll talk about in a minute, I'll show you a clip from that, was such a disaster. Those two, the 2006 campaign, the 2008 campaigns, were such a disaster that in 2010 they decided that they would solve all their problems. The Australian public hates us. You know, Tourism Australia has been this topic of controversy for years through these failed campaigns. So they thought, we'll crowdsource the ad. So they put out a national call and came up with this campaign called There's Nothing Like Australia, which is based on the crowdsourcing, the responses they've got. I should have put that in the PowerPoint actually, because it's the most awful TV ad ever broadcast. It's full of cliches. It's full of people in pubs drinking beer. It's full of people having barbecues. It's like every national cliche of Australia is in that campaign. It is absolutely terrible. I don't know who signed off on that either. The 2008 campaign is really fascinating. I'll show you the main ad.
Look, I just took me a break.
Yes, all of it. Oh, it doesn't matter how late I'll be up. Sorry, I don't know.
Busy day.
Hasn't been yet.
It's never gonna change, is it?
He's wanting his argument.
It's always work.
What are you saying?
That's my personal follow-up with.
This is a critical discourse analysis paradise as well. I'll talk about it a little bit more in detail in just a minute. I think I've got 15 minutes left. Is that right? 18. Okay, great. So I'll talk about that. But this was hated as well. Everyone hated it. It was actually directed by Baz Luhrmann, who at the time had a movie out called Australia. And it uses sort of similar style of cinematography to the movie. The movie starred Hugh Jackman and Nicole Kidman. Terrible movie, really bad. Oh my God, it's just full of cliches. The outback horses, you know, all that. But anyway, you know, to put things in perspective, 70% of the Australian population live in cities. Yeah. But anyway, so that adds part of a kind of a transmedia franchise, actually, and a sort of transmedia storytelling going on there because of the tie-in with the movie. Quite interesting. So multi-platform marketing as well going on there too. Quite interesting. But that campaign was absolutely hated. It was regarded as way too dark and negative and very much sort of downbeat, kind of aimed at the American tourism market as well, aimed at, you know, exhausted executives who are looking to replenish their batteries, you know. But I'll talk about that in a little bit and how we can think about it from a critical discourse analysis perspective. This is just some of the details of it. That's one of the stills from the magazine advertising campaign, which was much more lyrical, if you like, as opposed to dark. So tied in with the movie, the idea of that campaign was that it would be much more sophisticated than previous campaigns. And it does have that level of sophistication, you know, the lighting, the way it's shot and so on. It's kind of upmarket feeling in that sense. It does get away from the people in bikinis walking down beaches and so on, although swimming is still a thing. gets away from kangaroos being everywhere. And that was the idea as well, to get away from some of those cliches, but still people did not like it. So what I want to do now, just in the last few minutes, is just look at these campaigns and the overall campaign and think about how would you analyze it? What methods would you use and how would you use those methods? How would you apply methods to the problem of understanding where these campaigns are coming from, what the problems and successes and failures of them have been? You can do that from all sorts of perspectives. So I've just put together off the top of my head a little bit of hypothetical RQs, and there's 4 of them. What strategic priorities and market research informed the campaigns? How would you find that out? You'd probably go and interview some campaign practitioners. This is a very early, when I say where from, where does the method come from? I mean, this is a very early research method. And what will it help me discover? The attitudes and motivations and so on of subjects. And what I'm doing here is I'm sort of like, you know that parable of how many ways can you look at a camel? Or how many ways can you look at an elephant? What I'm saying is that this research object, these campaigns are like a camel or an elephant that you can look at through multiple perspectives in multiple ways. And depending on how you choose to look at, you'll think about your methods differently. So how would you do that? You'd go out and recruit a representative sample. You do some semi-structured interviews, perhaps, with participants. Make sure you respect the participants' times and views and so on. And you might also code your interviews. You need a phone, Zoom, maybe some travel to do your interviews. You might use InVivo as a software package for encoding them. And InVivo is a package I've used a lot to code interviews and texts and all sorts of transcripts. So you'd ask yourself, who am I going to interview? How do I discover who to interview? What should I ask them? You know, those kinds of questions. So you could analyze this entire campaign through its various phases using interviews if you're interested in how market research informed the campaign. Or you might want to know, how did potential travelers respond to the campaign? And you'd probably think about using a survey to do that. So this is looking at the camel from a different angle. This is a very well-established, it's also an ancient method. There's no sort of core text for surveys like there is for, say, critical discourse analysis. What will help me discover? What people or orgs say they think or do. And you might notice the way I phrase that. People actually don't tell you, this is one of the problems with interviews as well as surveys, they don't necessarily tell you what they're actually doing. They tell you what they think you want to hear they're actually doing. And phrasing interview and survey questions so that people are more honest with you is a real art. But it will help you discover what people or organizations think that they're doing, this technique. And if you use Qualtrics or an online survey platform of some kind, you might think about how you're going to recruit people and so on, and you might be able to find out how potential US travelers felt about the most recent campaign, for example, or the puppets dancing along the deck of the boat, you know. What identity discourses are embedded in these campaigns? And, you know, looking at the 2008 campaign, I think that's a really, really fascinating case study. One of the interesting things about it is there's an Indigenous boy. And when the Indigenous boy appears on camera, the machines in the background, the phones, the computer screens and so on, all go dark. And I don't know if you noticed that detail, but they all turn off. So what you have here is the introduction of a kind of primal spirit into the scene of the advertisement, and the primal identity of the Indigenous person as being an antidote to technology there. So from a critical discourse analysis perspective, looking at that as a form of discourse, you can see the introduction of the exotic other halfway through that ad, and how the introduction of the exotic other becomes the turning point in the discourse, in the experiences of the people of the couple in that ad. One of the other interesting things from a critical discourse analysis perspective is that the woman's perspective is introduced first in the ad, and that's unusual. So that's something at least to cling on to. And then that discussion ensues between the couple. Why is that? My hunch would be that actually women are probably regarded by Tourism Australia as the key decision makers in tourism decision making among young Americans. And that's probably why. It's not because they're thinking, let's put a woman first, let's have a woman speak first in the ad. It's probably to do with some market research that they've done. Or it might be that women are the key blockers in decision making, and what they need to do is convince the key blockers that to change their mind, to agree with their husband/boyfriend/partners thing. Very heterosexual ad as well. You can see the way the gender dynamics kind of play out through it and are overlaid with that discourse of race. And that scene with Indigenous boy pours the handful of red dust into the palm of the hand of the woman. So that's a kind of cultural exchange and a kind of quasi-spiritual exchange taking place there. That boy represents the primal spirit of Australia in some kind of way in that discourse. So there's a lot going on. That's a 90-second ad, I think, or 60 or 90, but there's a lot going on in just that one TV commercial there in terms of race and gender. You could talk about the other dynamic in that ad from a tourism studies perspective is work leisure. You know, the transition from work to leisure that takes place there as well, and a lifestyle transition that takes place as well. And what's the meaning of leisure in those people's lives, and what impact does it have? It's kind of restorative. And we know leisure is often restorative, but the way that's played out through that ad across those gender and race dynamics is really, really interesting. So, you know, you could note the scene changes in that ad and quantize it and put a log together of that ad and then analyze it scene by scene using critical discourse analysis. It'd be very interesting to do that. The last thing that I looked at was that I thought about is, well, what role do major travel forums play in tourism decisions? And you could use digital ethnography for this, and I did. I thought, well, if I'm going to ask this question, let's have a look. So I spent an hour or so on several tourism forums, including TripAdvisor forum, and that's a screenshot of it there behind me. And oh, that was really interesting, actually. What do people talk about? What are the dominant frames in use? And, you know, I'm thinking about ethnography, digital ethnography, and then I'm thinking about thematic analysis and framing analysis as part of that and how you use it. The dominant frames, and I didn't log these, but I just kept a mental note. The dominant frames are risk. Am I going to meet up with a poisonous animal? Or am I going to get eaten by a shark while I'm in Australia? So that was one of the #1 topics on the TripAdvisor forum. It was really interesting seeing that being discussed. The second dominant frame was distance. How far is it between cities and places in Australia? Because everyone knows it's a long, long way. I mean, you know, for an Australian, a 400-kilometre drive is just like driving around the block, right? We do it at the drop of a hat. Oh, yeah, we'll just drive to Adelaide. That'll take all day. Big deal. You know, 700, 800 kilometres, it's nothing. Distances in Australia are big, and it's certainly something that tourists are very concerned about. You know, if I was Tourism Australia, I'd be thinking about this: sharks, sharks, and very, very long drives. You know, long bus trips. You know, to go and see the penguins, it will take you an hour and a half on the bus. You know, just to get down to Phillip Island. Very short drive. It's like going to the shop for an Australian. So those are some of the methods that you can use, and that's an overview of the whole problem of methods and how to think about methods. That's all I've got to say. I'm hoping that if we run out of time completely, almost. I was hoping to leave a bit of time at the end, but obviously I talked a bit much. Thank you for listening, and we can talk about these things perhaps a little bit later on. I'm certainly planning to be here all day, so be good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Mark, for informative session. I'd like to confirm. Right,
Oh, we've got Q&A now. Excellent.
now we'll be having our Q&A, so I'd like to confirm if there are any more questions from the floor.
I'm very friendly.
Dr. Jasmine, are there any questions on Zoom? Amir?
Hi, yes. So there is a question on Zoom. And the question is, since research methods are content dependent, which is something that you mentioned at the introduction of your session today, I am wondering if there are any methods that you have found to be no longer appropriate due to the way data are now available, especially in the realm of social media. For instance, data on social media platforms are often concealed behind pseudonyms and anonymity, potentially affecting the authenticity of the opinions expressed compared to when they are provided in face-to-face interactions.
Yes.
Your opinion, Prof.
Yep, this is very, very true. And people develop personas that they use on online forums that are nothing to do with their real personality. And one of the, in the areas that I research, a big issue is that often people will have 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 online identities. And one of the things I've noticed, and you can start to work that out actually after a while, just through their concerns. And this is one of the values of digital ethnography, as opposed to just analyzing text, because you start to see the patterns, and person A, person B, and person C will turn out to be the same person. And you can start to see them interacting with themselves actually. And trying to start fights or try and start debates, things like that. And the way you start to tell it is because they start to use the same lexical formations, figures of speech, and you can just see the figures of speech coming up. You can tell once you get skilled at digital ethnography, you can start to tell what age people are as well through their cultural references. So through the things that they think are important. I remember when, blah, 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 things like that. So yeah, you can start to do it. Yeah, but that's definitely an issue. Who is the real person there that you do not know? A lot of the forums that I look at, everyone is anonymous. You might have heard of 4chan as a forum. I spent quite a lot of time on 4chan, and everyone's anonymous. Everyone's just an anon, but you still get to know people remarkably. So you can identify people, and sometimes for good or for ill, because you can identify people who are about to commit acts off the forum where they might harass someone or whatever, and they'll start bragging about it on the forum. So you can see the patterns in the discourse. The number one thing I would say where things have changed really, really rapidly is what's being called the API apocalypse. 5 years ago, maybe actually 6 or 7 years ago, I could write a script that would take me into Facebook, that take me into Instagram, that would take me into Twitter, and I could scrape any one of those platforms. Then the lights started going out, and Facebook went out first. I could no longer scrape Facebook because they cut off access to the application programming interface, the API. Twitter was the last one to go, and Twitter has gone now too since Elon Musk took it over. All sorts of digital tools are now obsolete because of that. I used to use a platform called Netlytics, and Netlytics was great. You just give it a start date and an end date, and it would scrape the web for you, and it would pull down all the stuff from Instagram or whatever that you wanted. It's no longer usable. In fact, it's defunct. And this is a real problem. And it's a real problem for my discipline, media and communications. You know, one of the things I noticed over the last 4 or 5 years, as Twitter became the last one, every single conference you went to, every single data set was Twitter. Hello? Twitter is a very small part of the online universe, right? And yet everyone's looking at this very small part. Why? Because the API was still open. It was researchable. So yeah, it's a real issue, and there's been a lot of change.
Prof. Ma, we have another question for you in the chat. So, dear Prof, if we use ethnography is there a limit to the length of the field research?
Absolutely. Yes, and yes. The way I do it is usually I do field research over a 4-week period. And usually I do 2 hours a day. And what I do in that 2 hours is you do a recap. So you scroll back through, if possible, depending on the feed, scroll back through and look what's happened. And then you do real-time observation. Most platforms have a peak period in the day. So you try and choose the peak period. Peak period for me, for most platforms, is when America has finished dinner and is sitting down behind their computer while watching TV. That's when people start to become active. So for me, unfortunately, that's not necessarily a very good time because there's a 14-hour time difference. But yeah, absolutely limit the time. Don't, 4 weeks I find is a really good period. You can do it in less, you can do it in 2, but I like to really familiarize myself. Immersiveness is really important. And with my PhD students, they're usually working for a 4 or sometimes 6-week period for their ethnography. Yeah.
For content analysis, do you prefer a prior coding?
Yeah. So this is the coding frame, right? And developing a coding frame is a really important part of coding. And in vivo, it will let you set up a coding frame and you can add terms as you go and so on. I usually do what I call a draft coding frame beforehand. And you do that as you're first looking at the data. You think these are going to be the main codes, probably, maybe. But it's an iterative process. Your coding frame probably won't stabilize completely until about halfway through the coding process. And that's absolutely fine, but it does mean you need to go back and recode. Because once your coding frame is set, then you have to go back and recode everything again. But if you set it too early, you're going to miss data, because what will happen is that new codes will emerge and you think, I've got no way of accommodating this new conversation topic within my existing coding frame. What am I going to do? So you might miss out on that conversation topic altogether if you don't revise your coding frame. So think of your coding, or at least this is the way I do it, and everyone has a different way of doing it. But thinking of your coding frame as developing it as an iterative process based on listening to your data as well as your a priori assumptions. And that comes back to listening to your data, like hearing what is in the data. I love that. Yeah, it is like music, your data. Listen to what's in that music. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. Mark. I think that's the end of our Q&A for this session. Prof. Mark, can I invite you to move to the right side of the room?
Yep.
Thank you, Prof. Next, I would like to invite Prof. Mustafa to present our token of appreciation to Prof. Mark.
Thank you so much. Everyone.
Thank you once again, Prof. Mark and Prof. Mustafa. So we'll be having a short break before continuing with our second workshop at 11:30. So if you'd like to loosen up by taking a short walk outside or grab yourself a cup of coffee to freshen up, please feel free to do so. We'll see each other back in this venue at 11:30.
It's a little bit too big.